Welcome to the Audiation in the Wild podcast with your hosts, Bo Talifer and Eric Rasmussen. Episode 32, The Subjectivity of Content Learning Sequence.
Okay, Eric, we're going to talk about content.
Yeah, content learning sequence. What content do you decide to add? Because there is no skill learning sequence without some content, and there is no content learning sequence without some skill, so they're married. I was listening to our last episode, or the last one I just published, so this will go back a couple of weeks. We did an episode on extensions, and as I was listening to it, I felt, as some of you may have out there in listener land, overwhelmed. Like, how do you do function training? How do you do all the tonal pattern training? How do you do all the rhythm pattern training? Include the styles. So there's got to be, this is something we talked off the air a little bit earlier. Where are the bebop rhythms in learning sequence? Where's the jazz? Where's the swing? Do we have rhythm patterns that go ba-doop dop doop 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 bop? Or do you got pattern? I do ba-doop doo bop. Or ba-ba-be-da is one of the easier ones for my kids at 3 years old. Ba-ba-be-da. And I even do them in the younger ages, but I don't wait for them necessarily to respond. But I have a 2-year-old that goes ba-ba-be-da. Not necessarily swinging yet, but he's really good. And really active with his body. But you get overwhelmed with all of that, and then all the repertoire, right? All the movement. Mm-hmm. If you're playing an instrument, you got to do stuff beyond that in terms of the technique and the breathing and the posture and the hand position. It's like there's so much that. How do you decide? And content is the place where that's where you really got to trim, where you got to cut down what you're doing. Major and minor, of course. Duple, triple, of course. You compare those two. Now, do you do major before minor or minor before major when it comes to, we're talking about formal learning. So once you get beyond informal instruction and the kids are in their singing voice, they're ready to sing in tune, a bunch of tonalities and meters, hopefully. They have a lot of listening vocabulary, right? And you've worked through Babel with them, and they should be readily available for you to expect them to sing pretty close in tune the patterns. Now, I don't do easy, medium, and difficult patterns because that just talks about it, or that points out the thing that I'm saying here, what we need to do to trim down to go quicker, depending on your purpose. So what's your purpose as the teacher? Are you trying to make jazz musicians? Are you trying to make concert pianists? Are you trying to get kids ready for school band? Are you trying to get kids ready to sing in a boys choir or children's chorus? So you got to establish your own purpose for that. And I know you and I have different purposes in a way, because you're working one-on-one and you're working with individual musicians, and I'm generally working in classrooms.
Sure.
But that's more a function of the population you're teaching. But what do you eliminate? What do you have to get through quickly? What do you avoid? And it's the fact that you avoid it is because, like I used to, because I couldn't sing well. Took a while for me to be able to teach tonalities and meters. Or tonalities successfully before I came upon from the reactions of the kids and the responses of the children I was teaching, that, my harmonic learning sequences came out of. So that I feel like I'm setting it up for a long episode, but it's a subjective decision to whether to go from major to minor, tonic dominant to major, minor, tonic dominant, subdominant. When does Dorian start? When does Mixolydian start? And if you start Dorian, shouldn't you start Mixolydian beside it? I think so, because the new comparison, separate from the two you've already established, And then what functions do you do? And, does it become a little bit haphazard at some point? Once you get a room full of kids where you've got, some low-hanging fruit to get well accomplished, and then kids with medium or moderate aptitude tonally or harmonically. How do you start to, by the end of the year, your class is more spread out than it is at the beginning of the year, because you're reaching the higher aptitude children more easily. They're the low-hanging fruit, as I was suggesting. They learn quickly. And so by the end of the year, it's a pretty disparate class. And then what are you doing? And then how do you manage your skill learning sequence with the content you're using? Everybody's getting the same content, but not everybody's getting the same skill level. So when I'm teaching the fast achievers, I keep stretching them and moving them along as much as I can without leaving behind the kids who aren't learning quite as quickly and maybe still aren't singing in tune, major and minor, tonic, subdominant. And I don't mean to miss rhythm, but what are we always providing for everybody? And for me, the answer always boils down to, hey, I got to introduce some new music. Let's get up and dance and move to something that maybe you haven't heard before. Mm-hmm. So I'm expanding their listening vocabulary, and that goes forever. That always continues. So, all right, I babbled on long enough.
No, there's a lot in there. I think that's a good setup. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind when we talk about what content should be in a music curriculum is who is taking lessons. Because, like, for example, I'm a private music teacher. People come to me to learn guitar. I don't teach in the school system or anything like that. And I think curriculum design is different in those situations because, I'm often teaching people how to play music who have this idea of playing music as like a hobby. Not that people in the school system don't have that idea, but I mean, my bias here is that in a school situation where you're teaching groups and you're in a high school or elementary school or preschool or whatever, I think you have more of a responsibility to design a curriculum that is kind of well-rounded in terms of what genres they're exposed to, what content they're exposed to. I think when you start teaching privately and people are hunting you down for a private coaching of a skill set, I think you should take into account their own genre preferences and stylistic preferences and all that. But even let's say even in the situation where someone comes to me and they're like, I want to be a jazz musician, there's still a lot of stuff to think about in terms of what content should they learn, in what order. Because even if you want to say jazz, we're going to learn jazz. There's a lot of different stuff going on. Like I recommend people learning jazz similar to how classical musicians learn classical music. You should learn how to play in different stylistic periods because they will teach you about A, the history of music, B, technique is how it evolves. So if we just strip things down for the sake of argument to tonality, not to say that rhythm learning doesn't have all these issues in terms of like a lot of people aren't learning Latin syncopated rhythms or, bebop rhythms or swing rhythms and all that. But if we just say tonality, because tonality very easily highlights how out of control the content level can get. So what do? I think having some benchmarks in terms of how you teach students. I mean, students should master stuff before they move on. I mean, this sounds almost obvious to say, but it's not common practice in almost any form of education. Teachers have this habit of exposing students to information, especially in spiral curriculums. So, for example, like a spiral curriculum is a curriculum that introduces a concept like once a year, like math, for example. A lot of math curriculums, like we do fractions once a year for 3 weeks and then never again until the next year. Music curriculum can have the same issues in it, but kind of what's better to do is have a curriculum that's more, I think the word for it is strand, where you're covering ideas that build over time. So let's say you're introducing rhythm patterns, or let's say you're introducing functions. You don't want to teach functions for like 2 weeks. Well, here's 1, 4, 5, and then for the next 7 months of the school year, you don't cover functions. The functions should build off each other. I don't think music teachers are often in a situation where they're falling prey to the spiral curriculum design as much as other teachers are, like math teachers, but it's important to consider because students should master content. That's what I'm getting at. So when you talk about having easy, medium, and difficult patterns, that's useful in a sense because if you know someone's audiation kind of tonal level, you can assume what they're going to be able to handle. But the thing is, a low performer and a high performer are going to learn the same patterns. It's just the high performer is going to learn more of them. That's essentially what we're talking about. They still have to. The high performer still has to learn the easy patterns. It's not like they skip that. It's just like a high performer in math doesn't just skip learning how to add and subtract and go right to multiplication. They just breeze through that faster. But I think it's really important to, when you're designing your curriculum, make sure students are mastering stuff because you can sit in your office and come up with some crazy plans in terms of what content you're going to teach students. But at the end of the day, if they're not mastering and absorbing the things you're teaching them, it doesn't matter how great your intentions or plans are, the students aren't going to be benefiting from it. And so I think in relation to the episodes we had about direct instruction at Engelman, and I'm very biased in this field.
I think we all need to be biased now. Everything's
so
going to be framed.
Some of those,
everything's going to be framed in terms of Engelman for me for a while.
Yeah, he's such a behemoth of kind of a wellspring of ideas. But teachers often don't make things easy enough for students and require students achieve mastery. A lot of teachers have a habit of exposing people to information and then moving on before it's properly assimilated. But I mean, another question is, beyond you just being a teacher, say you want to progress as a musician, how do you structure your own content? And I think that's a very interesting part of MLT because that's how I came to MLT. I am a music teacher, but my idea was here is like, what ideas exist in the psychological, like music learning research or music education research about developing your own and planning your own progress. And I hadn't seen a lot of conversations about these topics. You talk to great musicians who are like, yeah, I kind of just intuitively, practice a lot. But I mean, if you want to learn functions, how many functions should you introduce a week? How difficult should they be before you introduce a new one? Or how difficult should they be on first exposure? And those are really interesting questions. And I've found since absorbing some of Engelman's ideas that I'm learning more content with less repetitions, which is probably the dream.
Yeah, you're in charge of your own content, and you're thinking about it in terms of Engelman's principles. And so in one-on-one instruction or you with yourself instruction, the content choices are more aligned with the learner. Of course, you're right. And then, but as the learner, you're not just haphazardly practicing out of practices you've developed in the past. You're developing those practices based in some kind of quantifiable learning, and right, either and I'm looking for that too in my students. Like, it's got to be quantifiable.
And I think there's a tendency for people to not like quantifying what they're doing because they think it maybe blocks some type of artistic exploration or something, which I think is almost total nonsense. Because if we're talking about skill learning content, I'm going to take what my students are interested in into account. If someone comes to me to learn pop guitar, I'm not going to start teaching them like secondary 2-5-1s. Like, that's just so inappropriate for their goals because their repertoire they want to learn doesn't require the use of that skill set.
You said skill content learn, but you mean content. There's skill and content together.
It's like space-time.
Yeah.
Skill content. So for me, taking into account the student's intention is absolutely paramount. And that's why in kind of the general, I'll give you an example of my general framework. So if I have young kids, I'm just trying to teach them like all kinds of music, all kinds of functions. Let's go. If I have older kids that are teenage years or even adults that are taking lessons with me, I just listen to the genre that they're requesting to learn songs in. And I do a bit of harmonic analysis. So they need to know these tonalities and they need to know these functions in those tonalities. These are the ones that show up the most.
Yep.
I think the teaching functions that are easy to audiate and are high frequency in the literature they're showing you is a good place to start. So for example, like right now, I don't know why, but pop music has so much Aeolian. It's like, Ron trademarked floating Aeolian, which is what we're talking about is Aeolian with the one chord, the subtonic, submedian, and the three chord. So it's like you don't really know. Let's say in the key of A minor, it's like A minor, G, F, and C.
It's less subjective than an Aeolian tune that might be in the Gordon's experimental book.
I think you mean it's more subjective.
Yes. Did I say?
Yeah, it's more subjective. But anyways, I found that has changed where I teach Aeolian, and I understand Aeolian is harder tonality for some people to audiate, but in my experience, a lot of teenagers that listen to pop music, they audiate Aeolian like just as well as they would Dorian, and it almost makes more sense to just teach Aeolian right away because they have so much repertoire they're asking to learn that's in Aeolian. You might as well just start there.
Yeah. So it does depend on it really does depend on the listening vocabulary that they come with and the performing vocabulary that they've already come with. And then you're honing that strength because in doing so, you're going to reach that 70%, right, on the first attempt, right, to get started, right, and then build from confidence. I think we confuse kids unintentionally. I do like confusing my kids intentionally. If it's a good confusion, like, oh, we could do resting tone do, re, mi, fa. We could do resting tone ti, resting tone. Oh, there's all these resting tones we could learn. But and then it just paints the big overview, and then of course that just teases them. And what I think happens is that the children who are either smarter or higher aptitude or whatever may now interact with me like, what did you just, I need to know that. I want to know that. We're not feeling overwhelmed. Another
That's
piece
a
of
great
this,
point.
and then so I do like to throw mud against the wall and see how they respond, and then always back off way down so that it's easy for everybody, whatever it is I'm doing. One of the things that I really like is to take the children's ideas and incorporate, you tell me what to do. I let them take the steering wheel. Do you want me to do it, the right way, wrong way? You want me to do it major, minor? You want me to do it, with the same rhythm as this song or the same rhythm as that song or same meter if they have the vocabulary? You want me to do it like Twinkle Twinkle with the rhythm, or you want me to do it like Twinkle Twinkle with the resting tone? You want me to and I'm talking to 3-4-year-old children. How do you want me to do it? And they can tell me.
So the thing I want to point out about what Eric's saying here is that I think when you do that, that is actually more a reflection of your insanely high skill set to involve the students in a very well designed and intentional curriculum in a playful way. I think when a lot of teachers, especially younger teachers who are very steeped in this kind of like constructivist type philosophy, they would say like, I'm going to let my students choose what they do in lessons and I'm going to respond to my students. But what actually ends up happening in the lessons is there's no one driving the bus anymore, right? I think what you're doing is kind of like you're driving the bus, but you're letting the kid kind of metaphorically like touch the steering wheel while you're still holding it.
Yes.
Right? I think that's a better way to think about it. You're not just like, the bus I think the bus often goes off the cliff.
Yeah. And sometimes I say, we've done this for so long, I don't even know where to start today. Why don't you pick? We can do harmony, we can do tones, we can do rhythms, we can do styles. We start writing things down. It's like, okay. And that actually
cashes out in terms of like self-determination theory tells us that introducing autonomy or introducing choice is generally a fantastic idea whenever possible. But I don't think you should place autonomy kind of on such a pedestal that you're basically not even teaching content anymore.
Yeah, no.
Which is what happens.
All I am is always just deepening their tonal understanding, their tonal, rhythm, harmonic, audiation, and then style, and especially with movement. And I don't know what else there is to do, other than go more toward my purpose, which lately has not been about reading. I have these reading videos where I have first graders reading familiar patterns in unfamiliar order the very first time they've ever read unfamiliar patterns in unfamiliar order. Mm-hmm. And they just ace it. They sing it better than I could or ever did or would.
Sure.
And so I said, wow, you can do that? Okay, let's get to writing then. So we got to writing really quickly, and then we got to creativity, where they could put any tones with any rhythm, and we would just listen to it and laugh, because it was like, wow, this is, now do you want to make sense out of it? And then we need to understand that we have a place to end. Where do you want to end? Do, la, re, pick your tonality. And we'd read enough patterns that they could just kind of spew stuff on the page. You don't stop a kid at 3 years old from writing a story because they don't know how to make their letters. Everybody has that story of like trying to write like mommy in cursive, and it's just waves. There's no letters. There's no anything. But that's an entry level to like, hey, it's just we're playing like you play with the blocks. So some of this content I think arises naturally, and then some of it is purpose driven. Like my purpose is not necessarily to get them to read more and more complicated rhythms and tonal patterns and melodies, where I'd rather set up a stronger foundation for their own creativity, which can completely and maybe better off to bypass, the symbolic notation.
I totally agree. I mean, if someone comes to me to learn how to play pop guitar, which is basically what they'll be doing on their own time, is looking up lyrics to songs that have chord symbols written above them. You don't need to teach them how to do classic symbolic notation of individual tones. Yeah. I mean, what is that going to be doing for them?
Yeah.
It's useful to teach them how to. I mean, even theoretically to teach.
I'm sorry. I'm laughing because symbolic notation is a term you've used. It's symbolic association. And of course, it's attached to notation.
Yeah, so the reason I say symbolic notation instead of symbolic association is that I strongly believe the visual component of playing a keyboard and the visual component of fretboard instruments like guitars and violins, those are types of symbolic association.
Absolutely.
Even though they're like really correlated with kinesthetic association as well, there's a visual component. Like I can stare at my guitar neck and audiate what I see just as well as I can when I look at a piece of staff paper.
Point taken. It's actually a distinction, if you think about it, is quite appropriate.
Actually, for this conversation, it's super appropriate because if you're going to learn how to play blues guitar, for example, and you're going to read chord changes, probably never read Roman numerals, I would rather teach you to audiate chord changes in a key rather than solfege, because it's just not used in the tradition of blues guitar. Solfege is like never used. And Roman numerals aren't really used for a lot of people. Sometimes 1, 4, 5, but it's generally done more in a key that people are thinking of, like C or B flat. But if you're a guitar player, it's way more useful to symbolically associate the visual of the fretboard than staff notation in terms of individual pitches, because that's going to be more useful for your goals. And so this is, I mean, guitar is a bit of a, I think the complexities in navigating the stylistic and just technical problems with the guitar has made me very sensitive to this whole conversation that we're talking about, because like I teach classical guitar, I teach jazz, I teach pop guitar. You have to have different curriculums set up in your mind, or you will produce guitar players that are not getting what they ordered, essentially.
So part of your content's got to include technical considerations, of course, idiosyncratic, the idiosyncratic components of the instrument you might be working with, right? That of course there's voice, which is technical. If you're becoming a vocalist of some, you need techniques there to be stressed so that you're preserving the instrument. So there's so much to consider with content outside of the traditional things that are considered as a whole, speaking very gestaltly about all the things that are going on in a lesson, with the content, your purpose, the child's purpose, combination of all these factors in terms of tonal patterns, rhythm patterns, how many tonalities. You could get away with just doing major, minor forever and never include
in certain
anything
contexts,
else.
It might actually be a good idea to do that. Like if someone wants to learn how to play bebop and they're not interested in anything else, I don't even think it's worth teaching them, like definitely not worth teaching them Locrian. But I mean, you might as well just teach them a ton of functions in major, because that's basically what they're going to need. They're not even going to be playing in minor like that much. Minor, obviously, but like major and minor, you might as well just blast the function content.
Yeah.
Rather than going into all this other stuff.
Yeah. But if you take kind of blue and do, there's some heavy Dorian going on.
But there's some issues that come out of this. Like I've talked on this podcast about like the melodic minor modes are just as valid. Like there's no reason why the whatever 7 or 8 tonalities that Gordon was putting forward are the only tonalities. We were talking about Locrian sharp 2 is a really cool sound, and it's quite easy to audiate.
Yeah.
But what I see is a lot of younger jazz guys, they get into like learning how to audiate modes of melodic minor and harmonic minor, which is very interesting. Modes of harmonic minor. They get into that stuff before they can audiate like secondary dominance in major.
Yeah.
Like to me, that doesn't make sense. But maybe if they like that kind of music, but there's a lot to consider there.
Yeah, and those outside the normal Gordon tonalities, as valid as they are, might be better, put in the context of these, if you know your 7 or 8 tonalities.
Oh, totally. I mean,
the one feeds the other. That's all I'm saying. And at some point, the theoretical understanding comes in. And
okay, so can we? Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say that once you're audiating these things, then theoretical understanding can come in.
I think theoretical understanding and decoding are kind of thrown under the bus in this community, and I mean, basically the reason why is if you look at like where I am, for example, musically, I got a lot of content in my head, and I'm adding more and more. If I didn't have the theoretical understanding that I have, I could not design my own curriculum in this way. It just wouldn't even be feasible to construct it in the way that I'm doing it right now. And decoding, I mean, Eric was the first one to bring this. Eric was the first person to explicitly bring this like to my attention, even though it had been operating in the recesses of my mind. You can actually go from decoding into aural down the sequence. And I'm using this in a very loose way. I'm not. Yeah. I'm saying like I decode a melody on staff paper, put it on my instrument, learn to sing it, then learn I can go down the skill learning sequence, starting with decoding.
You're getting content from the page before you've learned to audiate it.
Yep.
And then put away the page, audiate it. Right? And if you have enough experience with, just decoding and getting the names out, it's kind of like when I first started playing, or not when I first started, when I first was getting serious about trumpet, I would play the thing and it would sound awful, but it would get a little bit into my ear by the 3rd, 4th time through. It was music to me. I knew where I was going. I was making predictions, and sometimes inaccurately, and blowing a note here and there. Some of that was technical issue and air support and like that, but it was probably an audiation error first.
Sure.
And then, so yeah, you digest it enough until you get certain skill level. My question for myself was, what would happen if I had been instructed early on with better learning sequence?
Oh yeah, sure. And time is an issue here, right? Like we're talking about a lot of teachers only teach half an hour once a week. Like the answer to how do I fit all this content in half an hour a week is you don't. That's the answer. It's just the reality of the situation. If we taught more like how a normal school teacher that teaches like math or English got to teach, and we taught like an hour every day, that's a different story.
Yeah.
The dose that you can review things at is much higher. And
yeah. So part of the content too is those choices are being made at home. You know, you go to this church, or you go to these concerts, or you go to this group party, or you've got friends in the neighborhood who you play with. So now you've added another dimension beyond what the music teacher is providing for the student. It's what the community is, what the parents are, or the family, or their larger environment, musical environment. You know, whether you're in one of these rip-roaring Detroit Baptist congregations versus, you know, another congregation where the style of music is completely different.
Yeah, I mean, even what movies you watch, I'm convinced from looking back in my childhood, trying to figure out where did this come from, because my mom's not a musician. No one in my family really is. My aunt, but she wasn't around us that much when we were young. But we were in preschools and daycares that sang to us, and so that obviously had an influence on me. But I would also, like, I could close my eyes and think of the whole soundtrack of Home Alone 2. It's like seared into my mind because I watched it like 40 times. It's like an hour and a half LSA that was on like 8 times a week, right? So like I have a feeling for a lot of kids, especially because kids like to repetitively watch shows and movies, they're getting a lot of their content from there, which is really interesting to think about. And that's why often when I have young students and I'm teaching them how to play songs by rote on the piano specifically, I ask, what movies have you seen? That's a great way to find songs that are in their listening vocabulary that they can at least imitate by rote on their instrument, and you're short kind of skip away from having them audiate it. Because I've often found, so I've started so many students like that, and I don't teach them to sing. I don't even really force them. I never force them to sing, but I don't even really encourage it until they're comfortable. And like I have students that I haven't explicitly taught to sing. I just did, you know, familiar songs by rote on the piano, and like give them a year or two and they can all sing in tune really well. And like it's because the actual, you know, whatever you want to call it, their audiation is being trained in a way that that's what's giving them the ability to sing. It's not singing technique. And I think singing teachers often are unaware of that. You know, they think it's singing technique that's stopping a student from being able to sing in tune. It's audiation that's stopping them from singing.
Yeah, for sure. And then not to ignore the technique of somebody who's, you know, in their at least later middle school years in high school.
Mm-hmm. You know, a lot of vocal teachers do this like thing where they do major scales like da 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 da, no 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 no, like they just go up in half steps or whole steps. But I wonder, like, what if you just did that
and tonal pad? That's a good, lovely warm up exercise, you know, for the voice to settle. But what are you learning auditionally there? Just absolutely nothing.
Yeah, I mean that's the criticism of scales. I will defend scales, you know, until the earth burns down for jazz musicians, but it depends how you use them, right? It's like saying I defend the screwdriver. Like for what purpose and how are you using it? Because just running scales up and down doesn't do much in terms of audiation. But if you run scales up and down in the context of a song in the right harmonic order, that can cement the functions into your mind. And the content issues are really interesting. I think part of content for instrumental teachers too is other types of skills. Like Eric and I were talking off air about this, but I'm more convinced now that teaching someone to decode is very defensible and has its own sequence that's often not honored. But I think teaching someone to decode on the piano is A, easier than any other instrument I can imagine, and B, actually useful. Like I would not wait to teach someone to decode notation until they can audiate everything, you know, Eric and I are talking about. Like one thing I'll often do is I'll teach someone to symbolically associate like just a basic tonal pattern, do mi so, and then I'll just write in things after the tonal pattern that go up or down by step, and they're not necessarily audiating before they play all that other stuff by step, but it's such a useful skill to teach on the piano because I mean, piano music notation is essentially piano tablature. That's what it is. It's designed to be played on a keyboard very efficiently. And I think making this kind of um dichotomy between like the way Gordon teaches to symbolically associate versus decoding, I don't think it makes sense. Like, I don't want to teach decoding before someone can sing Do Mi So. I'm not saying that, but I think decoding actually is fine to do. But the real issue with decoding is like, are you aware of when someone is audiating or when they're not audiating? Like, I know when I give my student that exercise I just gave you, where they sing the tonal pattern and then they decode the stuff that comes after it by step. I know what they're audiating and what they're not. I'm not assuming that they're audiating all that other stuff, although it starts happening to almost everyone really fast. So I really think decoding should be given more serious thought. And it should be given thought in an instrument specific way, because teaching decoding on a guitar is a fool's errand.
Yeah. Well, Andy brought this
takes
up
a lot longer
in his episode where the stepwise pattern, it's easier to perform, but not necessarily easier to audiate or vice versa. What am I trying to say? But anyway, that stepwise patterns and decoding should be so much easier and taken on jointly with your typical tonal patterns. And
I totally agree.
And when I have a student that starts to create and is using the piano, but not using any notation at all, except after the fact, let's remember this. We write it down as a way to remember. That's the real value of notation. That I insist that they tell me what function they hear under their melodies, and have them look for it and help them learn to explore and find the sounds that they like, so they go home and they're in their playland. They're not being told what to do. So to get from that kind of creativity back down to notation, it's like we need to remember that. And now here it is. And they're reading music on the side, or they have their own piano lessons. But with me, I'm trying to get them away from that and then incorporating it right back in and showing them the value of the notation, despite my not necessarily teaching them. I like to get to those inferential levels of learning, generalization and improvisation and creativity, as early as possible when they're ready. As soon as they show me enough readiness, just give them 3 notes. they can improvise. And I like using xylophones because just in terms of coordination, it's better for young hands and fingers. So there's another content choice, is what you choose to expand their audiation with, because when it comes to improvisation, the voice isn't the easiest. It's much harder. I'd rather them go for something and not like it, because that's the wrong note in their mind. So I love using the xylophone for their first types of creativity, for their first types of, the first beginning steps of improvisation. And then in the background, I'm hammering functions or doing, if it's something if that's my goal for the few weeks or months that I go down these roads. But I can take any. At some point, I do respond to the children, and if they're showing me so much more ability to create and improvise than they are in another thing, it's just the class becomes a little bit of an organism, and I dance with that. And as long as the drive and the interest is there, and they come in and they're happy to be there, that's a huge win. Because these kids are young.
Oh, I agree. I agree, and I think one of the challenges that comes from that is how do you actually engage in a spontaneous way, but make sure the learning is incrementally increasing in the right way.
Yeah,
and you can develop a good intuition for that, I'm sure. I mean, one thing I track what I do with students in a very loose way. I track the repertoire we work on, and I track the the tonal stuff we do. I don't track the rhythm stuff we do because that tends to be easier to memorize.
Yeah.
Where someone is on the achievement spectrum. Not, I don't do aptitude tests, so I have no idea. Until I think I have an idea after 3 or 4 years.
Yeah.
But yeah, I just track those two things, and I just make sure that we keep playing songs that we've played in the past so they don't forget them, and I just keep pushing more tonal content at them. And that way, if one of them learns, like, so say a student comes to me and they learn a melody at the start of this like Aeolian tune, and it just straight up has like a tonal pattern at the start of it. I try to take that out of the tune and improvise with that and do all this stuff, but it now just becomes a piece of content that we play with. I really like the xylophone improvising that you brought up before, because I think one of the great things about using like a xylophone to learn how to improvise is if someone has a command over some rhythm patterns, you can really explicitly show them how to improvise with rhythm patterns, and not just kind of like, you're still button mashing in the sense of like,
Yep.
The tonal content might be
the
random.
tonal choices are really a response to no, I don't like that, yes, I like that, or or being frustrated, or showing, hey, I made that up, and it might be total crap to you, but they made it up and they're proud of it. That there's some insights you get from children's responses, so that you then adapt. Let's just stick with these. I'm going to play dominant. Will you find some tones that you like with dominant? I'll play dominant. You play. You can play anything, but I want you to show me what you like. And sometimes they land on something weird and love it, and sometimes they land on something great and don't like it.
One of my favorite things to do when I'm getting a student to either practice a melody or we're improvising. This happens a lot when we practice a melody, though. They'll be playing a melody and they play a wrong note, but I can hear that note being part of like another function that I really like, and so I'll stop them for a sec and say like, hey, that would have been interesting. I'll replay what they played, but put the function that I'm hearing under it,
Yeah.
and it always like blows people's minds. It's really fun to do.
Yeah. You can always there are no wrong notes. There's only bad choices afterwards.
That's really cool, actually. You can get to the point where let's say you play a little chord progression in the key of C, hit any random note on the piano, and you should be able to hear some function. There's a function that goes under. There's something.
Yes.
That's really cool.
Yeah. So the bottom line is I got overwhelmed listening to the episodes, because like I don't teach that many extensions. Of course, my kids are only 7 or 8, but I do point them out, and that if I had them another year or two, and my purpose was to really get into more jazz chord progressions than the ones that I have been teaching, which included the dominant, the submedian, dominant, the supertonic, dominant, all the secondary dominants, and then some other ones. Substitute the 4 with a minor 4 chord and major, and vice versa. And I developed a good, and then I want to abandon that for a minute and go hard at improvisation and jazz progressions and like that, and see what might open up that way. I just go as far as I can with the kids I've got in a certain direction for a while, until I feel like I've kind of got a certain level of mastery on it. But what's killing me is like, if I could go back and contextualize all of my teaching inside of the Engelmann, I don't know what else might happen, or was I already doing that enough to get as far as I did? I'm sure some of it, but but just to get overwhelmed with the amount of content, because we've been talking for half a year, more than that, 30,
more than that,
30 some weeks now, and it's daunting, but what are you going to do? Take the pressure off the gas pedal for yourself. I mean, I'm always improving. I'm always trying to improve my teaching. That's the thing. I'm just always constantly driven.
I mean, we know like major and minor 1, 4, 5. The reason that's so powerful is that, like, choose a genre of music and you'll find that in it. Blues, classical, modern classical.
Yeah.
Chopin was on it, Bach was on it, Metheny's on it. So there's a utility in terms of like folk music, country music of starting there. But then a lot of that other stuff, it just depends where you want to.
Yeah, your purpose is driven, and then So the other thing I would ask people to consider is, Bo and I have exchanged playlists, but do that for your students. Give them, if they find something they really like, that's awesome that they haven't heard before. Have them continue to stretch their listening vocabulary. You don't have to teach it; just absorption. It's a playlist that they can move
that
to.
Can have a huge impact
on
on the order that you do things in. So, like, I had this jazz guitar student who he came to me, got him to do all the 1-4-5 stuff. His improv level just shot up in a year. But then the next things I gave him were really dependent on the stuff he was listening to. There was some stuff that was just out of the question, like you're not learning this in this order because it's just you're not ready for it. But the question of like, do I do 2-5 of 5 or 2-5 of 4 or 2-5 of whatever first? I think it's going to come down to like, what are they going to audiate faster and what's going to be more useful to them.
How much repertoire they already have in their listening vocabulary and what their technical capabilities are in terms of how far along they are.
And playlists serve a very important purpose, especially if you only get see a student half an hour a week. I mean, making sure that, because to me, like when someone has a goal, I don't care what you listen to, but listen to it enough that you know it.
Yeah.
And then we'll use that somehow. But that's why I found that I just keep a little notebook of graph paper, 2 pages for each student. And on the left side is the content, the repertoire, and the tonal patterns that they know. Again, I don't really track rhythm. I just assault everyone with rhythm enough. And I just make sure the content that they're using has been reviewed so they don't lose it. Because at a certain point, 1-4-5. I don't care if you learn Dorian next or more major functions or whatever. Just make sure you're building what you do. Don't just expose them to it and have it disappear.
Yeah, building in a very incremental strand, as you said earlier, right? There's a strand and then put that strand away, give them rest, and then come back to that strand at some point in the future. Not too long that they forget it all, and not too short that it becomes too mixed in with the other strand that's similar that you're now, putting in between.
You're basically novelty farming at this point, because like let's say someone works on a piece of music for 8 weeks and they're playing it over and over and over again, drop it for a few weeks or a month, bring it back to make sure they don't forget it. So all that work disappears, but it'll shine again in the mind. It'll have this feeling of, ooh, like that's nice again, where it kind of got stale.
Yeah. Sleep on it kind of thing. But sleep is better off sometimes 2 weeks at a time in terms of putting something to bed. And then bring it back out, or even a month. I was amazed at the number of tonal and rhythm patterns when give up on them and let them sleep, and rise them up again in a month or two, and it was just so much easier. That connection kept growing in the brain somehow by resting.
So this was another thing that Engelman talked about with because Engelman had schools and his teachers would do too much review, and he would say, at the start of the school year, like you're reviewing way too much. But the teachers thought that students needed like months of review, like basically like half a year. And he was like, no more than 5 lessons like at the start of the year of review, because essentially if they mastered the material, first exposure 70%, by end of lesson 100%. The rest of the year, that material should have been at 90% at any review. They don't forget it that fast. Yeah. So you can try to accelerate the speed, but I have often found that rather than trying to absorb more difficult content with more work, take the level of difficulty way down and increase the mastery and just incremental improvement. I mean, one thing that I've been doing, I've been taking like classical guitar exams over the last year, and since I got more into this Engelman stuff over the past few months, this last set of pieces that I'm working on, I just track it like how he says to track introducing content. Mm-hmm. And, I learn 2 to 4 bars of a piece at a time. And I try not to add too much. I don't add more until I've mastered previous material. And you'd be surprised, like you don't need that much repetition. A lot of musicians, especially instrumentally, they think you need to like repeat pieces for like hours on end each day. It's totally unnecessary if you introduce it slowly enough.
Yeah, I think eventually you hit a limit at what you're able to, technically get under your fingers in one sitting or two or over weeks. You need to stop, and then you'll come back to it with more connection to your tactile audiation or whatever you want to call it. That your fingers are moving.
I totally agree. There's a limit.
Yeah, and so skip a piece that's not all complete. Skip it for a week or two and then come back. The audiation stays in the brain. Audiation doesn't necessarily go away.
Sure.
People.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, people dust off things all the time and get back to it in no time.
Sure, yeah.
Because it's already there. You just need to refresh it a little bit. So I totally agree with you. I also want to say that I love, throwing out too much at a time, too. Just to.
This is where this gets weird because music-wise, listening vocabulary is not the same. Like getting someone to listen to something is not the same as asking them to like perform a math equation and trying to get them to do it right on the first attempt. So it's like it's weird to navigate what Engelman's talking about in terms of listening exposure, because I think there is a place for just kind of attacking people with listening content.
Yeah, I just like to. I always do a couple things to expose the geniuses if they're there in my class. I always try, I just put the worm in the water and see what happens. And so without taking anything away from this progressive, slow progression, and then let it sit and come back and pick up. If the children are showing you that they're learning very well and remember what you've taught in the past, I like also throwing a lot at them and then backing down right away with a purpose, with the purpose of discovering somebody who is hungry for something way beyond. There are a few kids I've had that have had IQs out of this world, and not necessarily music aptitude, or the other way around, or both. And there's some scary kids out there that I definitely wouldn't have stumbled on without using, the content that is like this is insane. And, it's like, but I want to find those kids. Those Joey Alexanders in the world are out there. He's barely a teenager 5 years ago. And he was already playing at a level of Herbie Hancock harmonically and rhythmically and composing and all this stuff. And he was 12 or 11 when I first saw him play. It's just you don't listen to him like, oh, he's a little kid, doing great stuff already. You listen to him like he's a master of the art form. I mean, close your eyes, you wouldn't know the kid wasn't 30.
It's funny, my intuition with those kinds of situations is, when someone's left to like their own devices, and like I don't know his history in terms of music teachers and stuff like that, but I think there is some survivor bias like at play with guys like prodigies basically. Because if let's say you have like 100 or 1,000 people with his level of aptitude, but why do they all not turn into Joey Alexander? I think probably what happens is some weird survivor bias where like he just was the one that took the learning sequence in the correct way, and then he's the one that we hear about.
Yeah. I wonder too.
He just spontaneously taught himself things in the right order.
Well, I promise you, his mom was singing and dancing and playing and whatever while he was in utero, or and Dad, I think, was already a jazz musician, and he had albums he played forever and ever when he was little. It's like the Frank Zappa story of him and that French composer. I keep forgetting his name.
Aviv. Edward.
Varese. Varese. Yeah, he wore that album out when he was in single digits. And I think that's crazy.
Yeah.
So there's that kind of content. There's the kind of content you present in your lessons. There's the kind of content that you're choosing because of the purpose of your ultimate goal, incorporating your students' input or family's input based on what they're there to pay you for.
Sure.
And then all these other things
we've been
talked
very
about.
loose with the word content, because traditionally in the MLT world, content is like tonal patterns and rhythm patterns, but we're kind of expanding this definition to like the things you teach in the lesson. There's one thing I wanted to share that I've been doing recently, again inspired by Engelman, but I think is so useful for instrumentalists. When you are learning a piece that has, like, let's say you have an A section.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say you have an A section, and then that is repeated at the end of the piece. The A melody is repeated, but with some embellishment, like different type of accompaniment or, more embellishment. What's really useful in terms of how you sequence learning this, don't learn those close to each other. Because what happens is you start to, this trapdoor phenomenon happens where you play the first A section and you learned the second A that's like way further down in the piece that goes a different place. If you learn them too close to each other, you tend to like sometimes make mistakes about which one you go to.
That's bad confusion.
It's bad confusion. So
good confusion is learning the A and the B. That's good because they're just different. It's like, how do they relate? How do they don't relate? But they're completely, easy to recognize as different. Where the other ones, it's like teaching a kid, Scarlet and Fire Engine Red and Crimson.
Or what's done a lot in reading and writing, teaching the letter B and the letter D at the same time is a horrible idea because they look the same. They're just flipped backwards. So, and they even sound the same. B, D. They have a similar label too, which is, it's doubly. What's interesting though, this technique has really reduced the amount of mistakes I make playing live.
Yeah.
And you just space it out by like, it could be a week, it could be several days, but just make sure one is more cemented before you add its doppelganger.
Yeah, put something in between.
Yeah, Engelman recommends put two things in between that are different minimum.
When I teach my classes, I do the hello song and sing a couple tonal patterns, and then I do a rhythm chant and we do a couple rhythm patterns. Then I do another song that's in a different tonality in a different meter than the things I've done prior. And then we get up and dance, and then we come back, and then I just keep generating more variety with specific intent of not confusing anybody.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly why you don't, if someone's not familiar with Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, don't try teaching them the minor one and quizzing them on the two. That's a horrible idea. They need to be really solid in the major one before you start fiddling with it.
Yeah.
Okay, I mean, this is a topic
we can go on forever.
Yeah, we were already going for an hour off air with a lot more profanity.
I left the F word in the last one.
We'll have a content learning sequence for swear words.
We'll do it Engelman style.
There's one that shows up with such frequency I recommend learning as soon as possible. All right. Okay, until next time.